Yes, if you look at the clock on the wall, it is indeed Biden time. Welcome. I am Christian Bladt, as always, joined by the one and only Mr. Scott Moore. Hello, sir.
Hello. It's great to be
Little
here.
early morning for us, and it's a it, look, depending on where you're sitting, sometimes election day is stressful, sometimes it's disappointing. It's hard. I wasn't that invested really in a lot of what people were voting on, but man, once results start coming in, and John King on CNN and Steve Kornacki on MSNBC, once they start walking over to the map on the wall, I'm like, oh, I can't stop watching this. There's there's just something about election returns, even when it's not a presidential election, it's not a midterm. When you really think about it, Scott, these are fairly insignificant elections, except for the fact that it's coming, 1 year into Biden's presidency. So, I think if you were voting for, city dog catcher across the nation, everybody'd be like, well, this is clearly a referendum on Biden, one way or the other. But how was it for you last night? I mean, we'll talk about the actual results, but did you find yourself getting more swept up by it than you expected, or did you just always know it's like this is like your Super Bowl for you?
It is, and to be honest with you, and I feel horrible to say this, I had stepped away and went and saw the new Sopranos movie screening last night because I had a group of friends and we went and I'm like, let's just go and just get dinner and just kind of tune it out for a bit. And I was watching it from my phone, but no big surprises for me though either. I
Yeah.
wasn't totally surprised. I mean, we'll get into some of the things that
What
I was surprised about, but overall, I was not that surprised in general.
what was less pleasant to watch? The Many Saints of Newark, or Curtis Lewa showing up to vote with his cat and not being allowed to vote in New York City with his cat and not understanding? He's like, well, why aren't there signs? Sir, there's signs everywhere. And he's got his electioneering outfit on as well.
That's
But
hilarious.
yeah, I was. Obviously, we have a lot of election stuff to talk about, but whew, that Sopranos movie that hurt. And then I saw the new
Mhm.
Halloween movie, and then it made me forget
Oh,
just how to, which
I
is
saw that too, and that was
that that
that
that
replaced
it
the
yeah.
worstness.
I was just like, I don't think I'll see a worse movie than this.
No,
And
no, I
then
agree with you.
and then Michael Myers was like, hold my beer. 1 week later, I was like, no, this might be the worst movie I've ever seen. Just period. So
That's so funny. I said that to some people too. The exact same thing about the Michael Myers movie. Like, how can it be this terrible? I mean, it's not
but
even a horrible horror movie. It's horrible across the
it's
board. It
just
was
bad,
absolutely
bad, bad.
terrible. Yeah.
Yeah. But speaking of bad, 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 bad night for Democrats in a lot of places. I think that there should be some bright spots, of course.
Hmm.
New York City, Boston. A historic election there. But I think really so much of the focus has been on Virginia,
Hmm.
and because despite what some people, despite what everybody that was outside waiting at Dealey Plaza yesterday thought, Joe Biden definitely, he won Virginia handily last
Hmm.
year.
Oh
And
yeah.
to see that shift, I mean, the red counties got even redder, and the blue counties got a little bit more teal. They're not so dark blue. I mean, it was like even when McAuliffe was winning, he was winning by like 10% instead of like 40. So as you saw the results, once they had really started to come in and they did the breakdown, what was surprising? I agree with you that Youngkin winning was not surprising. I think a month ago it might have been surprising, but it's just like, really the Trump election. I think in the first Trump election, the days leading up to it, you started to realize like, oh, this is not what we were told it was going to be. But what did you think when you saw just sort of some of the specifics for how people voted in Virginia?
Yeah, I think it was, I don't know if it was Buchanan County. It was somewhere in Virginia that's so red. It's gone from, plus 35 Republican in the past couple election cycles, something like plus 70, like it's doubled. So yeah, those redder counties were red. I think, the big surprise was actually the turnout among Democrats was still very high and very engaged. So that wasn't quite so much the issue. It was the fact that the Republicans came out and were energized to vote, which we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast and former iterations of this podcast. That this is not unusual when you have a party who's out of power. You get those voters that come out in droves. And what I think Youngkin did beautifully as far as a strategy for election strategy to get out the vote was something you're going to see probably other Republicans replicate as we get into the midterms, especially for statewide elections in more purple states like Ron DeSantis running for reelection in Florida, for instance, where he did kind of cater to that Trump base voter, but at arm's length, and still went out after the moderates and went for those suburban Republican women, which we were talking about last week, that had left the Republican Party over the last two election cycles for the Democrats, and brought them to come back home again by being a little bit more into, making whatever your thoughts are on critical race theory being taught in schools or whatever. He turned that into an important thing. And Terry McAuliffe didn't help himself by stumbling a few times and getting that quote out there that was being used as an election ad over and over and over again about like parents shouldn't have a say in how schools are taught, kind of thing. And so that was blasted. So you had he really had to thread the needle, which you have to win in Virginia, because even though people say it's a purple state or whatever, let's be honest, it really is more of a blue state now, because you have that heavy population center in Northern Virginia that's going to always come out and vote and go for the Democrats. That's why you haven't had a Democrat win statewide office in a dozen years now, since Bob McDonnell in 2009, the first year of the Obama presidency. So he had to thread the needle of trying to placate that Trump voter, but not alienate those other moderate and anti-Trump voters. And so that's going to be something I think you're going to see replicated now as a successful playbook for Republicans to try to move beyond Trump and Trumpism to get back some of those voters and to energize some of those voters that might have sat on the sidelines the last two election cycles that were very turned off by Trump and would continue to be. So that was unique. But again, we also saw that you don't really have ticket splitting anymore either, because the Republicans swept the other statewide offices of lieutenant governor and attorney general, which were both previously held by Democrats as well. And you also saw that Republican turnout helped to bring some of those assembly positions across the finish line as well. So now it looks like 51, maybe 52 to 48, 49 Democrats. So you're going to have a majority of Republicans by a very slim majority in the state assembly as well, because of that high turnout. It swept some of those closer races that might have gone to Democrats with a higher turnout, have now flipped to Republicans. So they got the turnout. They got a very energized turnout, and he got that win 1 to 2 points. Some of the other statewide lieutenant governor, attorney general, about a point. So it is very close, but that turnout does matter. And so that's what you saw in Virginia in particular, is that you just had an incredibly energized Republican base that came out off the sidelines. But meanwhile, you still had a pretty solid Democratic base. It'll be interesting to see how this pertains to 2022, though.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you're talking about the Virginia legislature, that was one of those late developing stories, because
Mhm.
it was still, East Coast time, it was like 10 or 11, and they still felt like it was going to be split 50-50. And then it became apparent that, just the Republican turnout in some places was even much heavier than they thought. And look, that's what happens when look, last year we had an unpopular an unpopular president, and the voting reflected that. And this year you again have an unpopular president. So the things that people were able to vote about in a lot of places, I think it made a difference. People are a lot more passionate. And the thing, Youngkin was exactly what he needed to be. He just needed to be a good candidate. He didn't need to be a great candidate. And Terry McAuliffe ran a fairly bad campaign. You're talking about, very specifically, there's things that you're handing it to your opposition. And his comments about parents and schools, and just sort of the very dismissive, we know better than you, it's like it's like the Hillary Clinton campaign might as well have started, printing out deplorable T-shirts and bumper stickers and just giving them out in red states, because you're just spoon feeding, the enemy from their point of view. Something that you can do. And it didn't seem like a particularly strong campaign. And to your point about Youngkin, he was the brilliant part of it was in no way did he, he kept Trump at an arm's length, but he didn't renounce Trump. he played it off perfectly because he's like, I'm just going to do this by myself. No thanks, Don. I don't need any help. I'm okay. And that's so you don't turn off the Trump voters. But I think Trump getting in, and look, there are going to be plenty of states next year where Trump will be an asset. People get even more excited. But I think you're absolutely right, except for like the reddest counties. I think that a lot of your, not even your moderates, just your slight center of, right of center, they're still going to just be like, yeah, they're not going to say I don't like Trump. They might even under pressure admit to being voted for, having voted for him. But yeah, I think that if they want to win, keeping Trump sort of where he was this time is what I think will work. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that next year than we would have if, just in a hypothetical, if this were the year that there was a midterm election. I think a lot of people still would have embraced Trump. And now I think they're seeing the value in not doing that.
Well, and I think two other things that he did really well too is that he basically said Biden was president, and he wasn't going on about the 2020 fraud, which again would be ironic because then you could say, okay, well, now that he wins, it was their fraud. Youngkin, meaning Youngkin. The other thing that was unique with this particular race is he also he's a very successful, I would say, compared to Trump, an actual successful business person who has started things from scratch as a multimillionaire. He's able to self-fund a lot of his stuff as well. So he doesn't need the money that you might not have to need and be at a deficit if you were running in Virginia as a Republican, that didn't have your own money. So he had his own money. And he also have a unique thing where you have Terry McAuliffe, who was previously governor, who's sort of carrying some baggage. And when you talked about Hillary Clinton, I mean, he's about the closest thing to the Clintons you can get. He worked with them for many, many years. And he also was DNC chair for many years. So he comes with a lot of baggage. You're reprising a person who was already governor back in the mid-teens. So you're not even coming with somebody that's new. So it's very easy for Virginians to go back and look and say, oh, okay, we know his record, we know him. And he was not a great candidate then. And he barely eked out a win in 2013 at the beginning of Obama's second term, which was sort of the first time it kind of bucked the trend for Virginia, again, electing a governor of the same party, but it was really, really close. But, the fascinating thing is, if you were to look at the numbers from last night as opposed to what it was a dozen years ago when Bob McDonnell, the last time a Virginia governor won, a Republican there in the first year of Obama's term, the numbers were closer than they were in 2009. So, I mean, yes, the counties have become redder and become bluer, but the actual overall numbers, the raw numbers, it was a tighter race. So that was kind of fascinating. So, I mean, if you're looking for a little bit of brightness for Democrats, is that Virginia really is still a purplish to blue state that's leaning very blue and will continue to lean that way. And I don't think it changes the dynamics for 2024. Let's say if Biden runs again, or Kamala Harris or whatever. I think it doesn't change the dynamics because, again, if you recall, they lost handily, the Republicans in the midterms, but then President Obama won re-election handily, and he also won again in Virginia. So people do have to look at this with a grain of salt. It is a unique thing. We've talked about this before. Statewide races are very unique, and they're to their states. And you do get governors of opposing parties elected a lot of times in states where still the national trend line is still the opposite. So it doesn't really mean much as far as the bigger picture of things, except that, yes, likely, like we said last week, it's a warning sign for Democrats going into the midterms that if I was betting today, I would say the Democrats would lose the House and the Senate. But again, it's not a surprise. It happens every time. So I see all these Republicans posting about stuff. I'm like, this is not any different than any other historical time period. But granted, yes, we have a unique situation now where Biden is already pretty unpopular in his first year. Not quite as unpopular as Trump was, but he's getting in that place. And you can see that it is setting the tone that there could be a pretty big washout for Democrats in the midterm, bigger than they would hope. So that is something that's never good for a party in power.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that yesterday could have been a slam dunk, huge success for Democrats, and I still wouldn't be surprised if they lost the House and the Senate next year. I
Right,
think
exactly.
that's just what the trend is. Biden could be very popular, and
Well,
I would still not be surprised if that happens next year.
and just going into those unique state kind of races too, when you go back to 2019, you see that Kentucky and Louisiana had Democratic governors. But then again, they went handily for Trump the next year, and
Yeah.
because again they lean Republican. But when you have a statewide, that you have unique candidates, unique situations, you can vote for uh, governors of opposing parties in a state that doesn't normally elect those type of governors. And John Bel Edwards won re-election handily that year in Louisiana, and Andy Beshear, who was the son of a very popular governor in Kentucky, won as a Democrat, beating an incumbent there. So you do see these things happen, and it's not completely out of the realm, and it doesn't really pretend to anything the following year in a more of a national election. And the difference too is that in a national election like the midterms, you will probably see Democrat, especially now. This is again where you're going to get the reverse, because now Democrats going to be locked out of state power in Virginia. So now they may be more animated to get out and vote as well, especially depending what happens between now and then. And they could help run up the score in some of these things too. So you have to take it with a grain of salt too, because the party that's then now out of power has more of a vested interest to get out and make sure they vote. And that's sort of what we've talked about, what happened in 2016. A lot of people just sat back thinking in the national election, Trump was never going to win. I don't need to go out and vote. I'm not really big on Hillary Clinton, but everything's been good. We've had Obama for 8 years. She's going to come
Yeah.
in power. So those are the things. And when you're in power, it's less likely for you to feel motivated to get out and vote, as we saw yesterday. So it'll be interesting to see, but it definitely is a clear warning sign for Democrats over the next year. And we talked about this last week. They've got to get their messaging down a lot better too.
Right. And obviously, a key would be trying to have something you can point at that you've accomplished. And they've spent so much time trying to get the spending bill passed that, there aren't like little victories along the way that they can point to. It's like all their chips are in on this, and that's what they're going to try
Well,
to
they're
go ahead.
struggling with inflation. They're struggling with
Yeah.
supply chain issue, and not they, because it's not
It's everybody,
completely,
but I mean,
but
they're the
Congress
ones
is
in
losing
charge
control.
and
So
considered to be responsible for it. Sure.
so a lot of people are dealing with that right now, and so that compounds the issues too. And then you have more of these culture wars between critical race theory taught in schools and making it local, and the mask mandates and other things, that it becomes more of a culture war issue if you can turn out voters on that more than the actual substance. Because like we've talked about, Youngkin did good with some of his stuff on that, but he's still lacking real substance besides hyper focus on these local school issues. Which again, that's Republicans' thing. They don't have a
Yeah.
real clear message because they don't have one at all. They're just going completely on culture wars, but it has worked for them a majority of the time, and the cult of personality works for them, and everyone gets behind it. So it will be interesting to see how this shakes out for them. But they've got a great. I mean, the good thing for Virginia too is they got some diverse candidates too, which can blunt the issue of saying it's racist when you have a black woman lieutenant governor elect, and you have a Cuban a descendant of Cuban American attorney general elect for Virginia. So that also does help, at least the optics for Republicans, to say, hey, look, we're not just old white men. We can branch out. And that kind of blunts some of the concerns that it was a racist vote in Virginia because of critical race theory, when you have those other people win as well, that were kind of swept in with Youngkin. So that can help the Republicans at least blunt that a bit from saying that's all it is, when you can get some diverse candidates in there too.
Right. And it's also hard to paint the Republicans as racist when the current outgoing governor literally painted his face
Right,
blackface, and the
right.
photo made the rounds, and he was right. Just wait it out. That did go away, and I think that the fact that he wasn't able to run for reelection, I think, had a lot to do with that. Because
Well, and
had he been on the ballot
mhm.
last night, that would have think about how much you would have seen that picture in the last year.
Well, and that's going to be what's going to be interesting, is now who will run on the Republican side in 2025, because again, you can't have two consecutive terms.
Right.
So this is a one and done. So is it going to be Winston Sears, who's the lieutenant governor? Will they go after that? And that would be interesting, to have an African American woman run at the top of the ticket there on the Republican side in Virginia. So it will be interesting to see. That's what I'm saying. This helped them diversify
Yeah,
their slate a bit.
absolutely.
But it'll be the first year again of either a Democrat continuation federally, or it'll be a first year of a Republican presidency in 2025. And in that case, so we'll see how the dynamic plays out. But that's the unique thing about Virginia too. This is a one and done thing. So Youngkin doesn't have to run for re-election. So it'll be interesting to see who does run in 2025 in Virginia, and can they continue to kind of flip that switch, or is Virginia going to continue to move more towards the left and things settle down in some of the other issues that are going on right now, and it kind of reverts back to a Democratic level at both the state and federal for Virginia. So, which again, you see the trend lines in it, and it clearly is. So, a one-time election doesn't say much, but it does say a lot for Democrats. Like we said, they really do need to pay attention to this for sure.
Yeah, and I think we can be reasonably sure that in 2025, someone who will not run is Terry McAuliffe. So Democrats, whether or not they have 3 years to figure out exactly who should run, and go from there. Last week we did talk a lot about New Jersey, and as I mentioned, I grew up in New York State, but I literally grew up 4 miles from the New Jersey border. So much of my family, almost all of it really at some point, is from New Jersey, my extended family. So I'm very well versed in the state of New Jersey and the opinions there that run rampant, and just how varied they are, in the different parts of the state. And it's sort of a very local realization, but a lot of my family grew up in Bergen County, which is an affluent suburb of New York City, and that was overwhelming against Murphy. And I think I believe that I keep wanting to call this guy Citronella Candle, but I believe it's Citarelli. And boy, that I last night was the first time I'd actually heard him speak, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is like, if you were casting New Jersey politician in your screenplay and you didn't even give him a name, it's like, yeah, let's have this guy read for it, because he sounds like a lot of those people that I know who are New Jersey voters. And people were you had a lot of people who were very upset at Governor Murphy, but it's more that they were upset a year ago. In general, I think people are happier in New Jersey. And it is one of those states though where you have these huge like metropolitan areas that really dictate how the state votes as a whole. I mean, it's like New York City wipes out, so many of the other counties in New York State being, very bright red. And it still is a little surprising how close it's been. I mean, he was leading a lot. I can't believe they're still stuck at like 86%. I just looked a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
And it's like, it was at 86% when I went to bed last night at midnight our time. I'm like, so you haven't even gotten like 1% further since then. So I guess it's a lot of vote by mail and stuff like that.
There is. Yeah.
Yeah. What, and look, I think ultimately just because of where they point at, where votes are still outstanding, it seems very likely. But, I mean, at one point last night, it was like separated, like Citarelli had like a 565 vote lead, so it obviously got very tight a few times. And did it surprise you, at least the way it's looking, is that it's going to be Murphy's going to win, but it's going to be a really close, a very small margin of victory?
Yeah, I think that's what surprised me the most, because that's even more so of a state that is more democratic. I mean, yes, again, you have some very big red pockets, especially in Southwest Jersey, and but Biden won there by plus 16, and it's a democratic state. But again, it's a quirky. Again, when you have local stuff, it's very quirky. Some of the bigger issues were the property tax things, and that came down. And I think that's probably why Murphy didn't do as well in Bergen County, because they want to raise property taxes, and that I think drew a lot of those people in the affluent areas out, or less tamped down their voter turnout. I am surprised by the tightness, because Murphy had a clear lead, a pretty substantial lead in the polls, as opposed to Virginia, where, as it turns out, the polls are going to be pretty accurate. It was like a +1 to 1.8 for Youngkin, and it looks like it's going to be right under 2 once all said and done. So the polls were great there. A little bit not as solid in Jersey. I do think that, yes, Phil Murphy's going to eke out the win. The other unique thing about Jersey, too, is that they haven't reelected a Democratic governor, God, in like 40 years plus. Like it's just a weird quirk, where they have tended to vote Democratic at the federal level with their senators and again president. I don't think they voted for a Republican since George H.W. Bush in '88, but they have not rewarded Democratic governors with reelection there in the same way that they've done for Republican governors. So this is actually kind of a unique thing too. If Phil Murphy pulls out this win, which I admit is going to be a very razor thin win, but it does look pretty likely once those vote by mails come in from some of those more popular counties and like Essex County and some of the other areas there that are outstanding, he will pull out the win. But it's going to be very close too. I think that was my big takeaway, but I hadn't read as much on the property tax issue and some of the other statewide issues that were part of the reason that might have drawn, and again, being an off year, that were drawing some of these Republicans that we saw, like Virginia, it was the same kind of thing. They were motivated to go out and vote. And again, you're going to reelect an incumbent, and the Democrats not necessarily as excited. Or again, thinking he's got the bag, and so they're not feeling motivated to go out and vote to the same level, especially in Jersey, as I think you might have had a little bit more in Virginia, because again, the turnout was pretty solid for Democrats in Virginia. So I think that was the biggest surprise, the closeness, because last week I said to you on this podcast, I'm not even going to think about it because Murphy's got this in the bag, at least thinking it would be, in the mid single digits, not at all where they're eking out a win here.
No, and I mean, this seems to be the one that's outstanding where they just still don't know. Even with 86%, it's too close to call, and I think we essentially know everything else of consequence, at this point, and of course, when it takes longer to vote and, you start dipping into the mail, apparently this is the only election that is rigged from last night. All of the Hugo Chavez produced election voting machines from last year, I guess they all got taken out of circulation and replaced with ones that worked, because I didn't hear anybody complaining about the vote in Virginia.
Right.
But apparently in Jersey, because that's what the criminal element in New Jersey is going to do. They're going to rig an election for the Democrats. That seems to make sense. So
see that it's like, and that's what, to your point of like when they stopped voting overnight, it was like, oh, so they can start the steal overnight, and that's the whole thing. And I was like, oh my god, but yeah, it's so asinine. But
but look, I thought this last year too. It's like, why is vote counter a job that isn't done in shifts? It's like, all right, well, we have to go home and go to bed. Yeah, great. But then the late shift comes in, I mean,
right. The third shift
you can keep counting. Yeah. Just don't stop counting just because, look, and I don't want people counting votes when they're tired. I don't want them making mistakes. So let them go home. That's fine.
Right.
But I think that's where we'll get there. We referenced it in passing. There were not really surprises in New York City that Curtis Sliwa did not really run a strong campaign. I mean, to win, look, New York City has had some very high profile Republican mayors, obviously, Giuliani, and Bloomberg ended up being an independent, but he ran the first time as a Republican, and obviously at Koch. I mean, the mayors you think of from New York, for the most part, are the Republican ones. And with de Blasio being so incredibly unpopular, I think that there probably was an opportunity for a charismatic Republican, but I guess they couldn't find any in New York. And look, I think Curtis is somebody who is very well known there. I mean, he's had a radio show for years, and he's known as the Guardian Angels. And I think that I don't know that much about the ins and outs of how he would govern, but for somebody that took up that cause for what New York City was in the late 80s and decided that, police could use some help in the Guardian Angels, organizing and helping out. So I find him to be, at least throughout history, I find him to be something of an admirable person. I just don't think he ran a good campaign. And, Eric Adams, obviously his track record as not just a police officer, he's a police captain. So I think that you can secure the police vote in Manhattan. Well, it's all 5 boroughs. If you can secure the police vote in New York, it's going to be a lot easier to win. If you're running against the cops, that obviously becomes difficult. So no real surprise there, except of course for the odd incident I referenced at the top of the show with him trying to bring his cat in to vote with him, which
So hilarious.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll add there is that Ed Koch was a Democrat, though.
Oh my gosh, you're right. No, you're absolutely
And
right. And
and
then
Bloomberg
he was
ran,
replaced by Dinkins, who was also a
yes,
Democrat.
also Democrat,
Yeah,
and then Giuliani,
absolutely.
and then Bloomberg. But Bloomberg ran again, I believe, for a second term as a Republican, switched through his second term to an independent,
Yeah,
and then was able to get that third term in
he
there,
got that third term. Yeah,
which was something Trump would probably be envying, which he was able to do. But now we're back to
back to
two
two
terms.
terms. Yeah,
But yeah, they do get Republicans for sure. And again, they have to be more moderate to win in a state or in a city like that.
true.
But again, like we've seen overall, we've seen the likelihood of having those opposite parties come into power in some of these places as a less likelihood. And so, as we've seen, New York is I mean, my goodness, a heavily Democratic city, which then in turn helps to pull the rest of the state Democratic every time. You're not going to really see a Republican come in unless it's a very unique Republican that can win citywide, and that's just at this point, it's going to be pretty rare for that to happen. So, I mean, everyone was basically calling Eric Adams the mayor before, sadly, before the election even happened, because it was just kind of a foretold conclusion that he was going to win. And the good thing about Eric Adams, which also brings some uniqueness and which is good for Democrats, is he's more of a moderate Democrat. He's not coming in as a progressive, and he's going to come in as something that's again a playbook. I think that Democrats can use for some of the more purple areas as well, even though New York City is heavily Democratic, as far as his positions and what he was doing and how he's campaigning. Like Eric Adams is going to be a very big, different mayor from de Blasio. So that I think is something that Democrats can look to as well for future elections on how to win as a bit more of a moderate Democrat and in a more purple region as well.
And then also, Eric Adams is only the second African American mayor in New York City history. The other being the aforementioned David Dinkins. Up in Boston, Michelle Wu made history. She checked several boxes. She is the first woman as mayor of Boston, and the first person of any color, person of color, and she's also Asian. So it's a lot of firsts. And look, I mean, Boston is typically a city that you think of, and it is definitely a generalization, but you just think of the palest, most Irish person and you think that it's a city filled like that. It's like a city of Larry Birds, and that's not at all true. I mean,
Not
especially
anymore,
when you
but
consider, because when you consider just how many universities and schools are there that just people work at. So obviously, you're bringing in people from all over the world that live there and vote there. So, and I can't say that I know much about her, but it's nice to see when you can see a city like Boston, Boston, who had to bring the National Guard to integrate their schools in the late 60s, the Boston Red Sox being the last team in Major League Baseball that had a black player. It's there is a reputation that Boston has, and it's nice to see that but yet it's usually fairly consistently it's usually a Democratic stronghold. But so I think it's good to see. I mean, those are that, and Boston and New York City are bright spots for Democrats last night, but they should usually be.
Well, and I'd say for Boston too, the great thing about it is also Michelle Wu's only 36, and she's the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So this is another thing where you can look for Democrats, can see here's a future of our party. She's 36 years old. She's now going to be leading the biggest city in Massachusetts, and now the future is hers of where she wants to run next. Is it going to be governor of Massachusetts? I mean, she's going to be a potential future for the Democratic Party at large. So this win not only has a lot of firsts, but you also have someone who's young and really this is the future, and that's what you want to see, as opposed to someone like Joe Biden, who's the past of the party, that got in. That's going to be 79 in a few weeks. So seeing that as well is another good plus, is that you have someone who's young and ready to kind of lead the party into the future for potentially decades to come. So that's the other bright spot for Democrats as well. And other bright spots were progressives won Dearborn, Michigan. You have an Arab American mayor who won there in Dearborn, which is a big city there outside of Detroit. You saw Buffalo. You saw, again, no surprises, Cleveland, again, because cities are going to be Democratic, but you saw some good progressive wins. And also, what Republicans haven't been talking about is they lost a lot of the school board elections in more of a conservative states, like in Iowa, for instance. So you won't hear them talking about that, but they didn't clean the board by any stretch for some of these school board elections either. Those went to Democrats as well. So there were definitely some bright spots for Democrats, more than I think people realized. They were just hyper focused, and rightfully so, on what was going to happen for Virginia, which is a decent barometer, being a more purple-ish region. So rightfully so, but there were definitely some clear bright spots for Democrats as well. And like we've talked about, to see what's going to happen next year, likelihood Republicans are going to sweep into power in the midterms, but it's not it's not written in stone yet, depending on how things shake out over the next year and how involved they allow Donald Trump to be involved in some of these things, because that's also going to affect things as well. So there's still a lot that's going to happen between now and then. So I wouldn't read too much into statewide things. And I've said this before, if Democrats has won too, it doesn't. If Democrats had eked out a victory in Virginia, I'd say, oof, Democrats barely escaped that, but it still wouldn't mean anything to me for next year. The likelihood they'd likely still lose the midterm. So you just have to take it with a grain of salt with these off years and these statewide elections that are, again, very unique.
Well, if McAuliffe had won in Virginia yesterday, I think Democrats would have learned even less and make less changes for next year. So it could be very valuable. And I only want to spend a moment on it, but I was fascinated by this, that in Buffalo, New York, way upstate near the Canadian border, it appears that a write-in candidate won, which you don't usually see. I think didn't Lisa Murkowski win as a write-in not too long ago, but that's the only other one I can think of. And also that is, that having that last name obviously went a long way and people were familiar with her. But I guess the sitting mayor of Buffalo, Byron Brown, it appears to have won as a write-in candidate. And so that's always interesting when you see that, and it's, I guess they have to count all the absentee ballots and then examine the actual write-in and make sure that there aren't 10,000 votes for Mickey Mouse, which, by the way, there could be. You don't really know until you actually take the time to look at it. But so, look, it's something to be said for people who vote, especially in smaller local elections. If you really feel that you want to write someone in, that vote counts too. So sometimes there's something to be said for that. I wanted to get your thoughts on, it wasn't a candidate, but there was this measure in Minnesota to essentially defund the police and replace it with a community task force, I think is the term. And even in a incredibly blue, look, Minnesota is such a Democratic state that they actually voted for Walter Mondale, and granted he's from there and that's the only reason why, but still, that's, you want the definition of blue. I'm going to assume they also voted for Dukakis. So, if they probably didn't, but anyway, the point being, so that is apparently not a winning issue. And you can probably find cities where it would pass, but were you surprised that in Minnesota that was, I think, was it specifically in Minneapolis or was it statewide?
It was Minneapolis. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. That is a very left leaning, very progressive city. And they were not interested. It wasn't like it was close either. That was a wide majority was not interested in that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. I would say Minnesota is lean Democrat, but I wouldn't call it a Democratic stronghold by any stretch. And it's gotten tighter and tighter because, again, we've seen more of this divide where the rural areas are incredibly red, and you have these little blue bright spots like Minneapolis and St. Paul. But they're not it's not a hugely Democratic state. It's always just kind of eked by, especially the last several years in modern times. But yeah, Minneapolis was ground zero for George Floyd, and if anything was going to have an effect, it would be there. That was the epicenter. So the fact that it was rejected is not completely surprising, because I didn't think it was going to pass either. I think that was a thing at the moment when people were incredibly frustrated and upset. And yes, we all agree that there need to be reforms, but defunding the police would not necessarily be the way to do it. And we've seen crime has risen. Again, I love that Republicans try to point it out that it's a Biden or Democratic issue when crime had been rising over the tail end of the Trump years as well. So, but it's convenient for them to leave that part out. But the point is that it is a losing issue, and even and we have talked about this ad nauseum too. Just calling it defunding the police is just not the way to do it, because it just sounds like you're taking everything away and you're not going to have a police force. So that whole strategy is dumb. But hopefully, this will get the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to kind of drop that issue, because it does not work. And most Democrats do not want to see the police defunded, and so hopefully, again, it's going to come down to how well are the Democrats going to be able to message into the midterms to at least staunch the bleeding if they do lose the House and the Senate next year. Because again, they're razor thin wins, and even if Republicans win back next year, they're going to be razor thin wins. And the Republicans always sort of have that built-in advantage because they have gerrymandered the heck out of everything they can do. The congressional for Congress, for the House, and then for the Senate, you have states that will vote for Republicans that represent far less people than Democrats do. So, the wind is always at the backs of Republicans, and so all they have to do is have a good cohesive message to pull it forward. But the key is going to be Democrats and how they're going to message us, and hopefully they will realize that defunding the police is not a winning strategy heading into midterms.
Yeah, I think that this is there are many teachable moments for Democrats, things that went their way. They can look at why they worked, and they can look at why some candidates didn't succeed. And even like we've said, if Phil Murphy does indeed win, you can really highlight what it was about him that made things so strong for the Republican candidate. So in our final few minutes here, Scott, obviously Joe Biden not on the ballot. And in all honesty, yes, governor's races are important, but it shouldn't change his ability to do his job today. And I believe he's still not speaking with any reporters today. But so what do you think should be the focus? I mean, for President Biden to there's a lot to try and get accomplished before the end of the year. It can't all wait until 2022. So what do you think the White House, and while they still have their very slim majority in the House and the Senate, what should President Biden and the Democrats be focused on?
Well, again, they need to stop the infighting, and they need to get this Build Back Better plan signed, and they need to then go out and campaign about it when they do get it signed. And then you say, this is what's in the bill, this is how it's going to help everyday Americans. And that's going to be their key to get this done by the end of the year. I saw that they want to add paid family leave back into this again, but somehow it's going to take 4 weeks or something. So you're already pushing it till the end of the year. So they've got to get this done across the finish line before they go on holiday recess at the end of the year to be able to say, this is what we did. And when they go home for the holidays at the end of the year, they need to be able to actively campaign with their local constituents and say, this is what we did, this is what's in it. Because I think a lot of people are just hyper focused on the price tag, and that's all that's been going on. And then Republicans are slamming it for the price tag, which again is ironic considering the tabs they ran up during their years. But they're messaging on that, whereas Democrats need to come out and say, this is what's in it, and this is what's happening. And Democrats need to stop their infighting. Again, it happens with all parties. You can go back and say the same thing with Republicans. You get one or two, if we recall back with the Affordable Care Act, you had a couple of Republicans that did not vote for it. And you didn't see the, oh my God, Republicans are infighting like crazy. They're disheveled. They're out of, they're not cohesive. And so it happens with parties, but you've got to get Sinema and Manchin on board, and then you've got to go out and campaign for it afterwards, like you would anything else leading into 2022, to say this is what we've done. And they've got to tighten up their messaging. You can't just be about anti-Trump right now, because that's not going to work for you. When it's all said and done, you've got to focus on local issues again. You can't let the Republicans paint you into, the critical race theory. You've got to do better about that, about allowing, local school boards to do what they do. Because again, you could go back and say with Ron DeSantis in Florida, for instance, he was not allowing local school boards to enforce mask mandates. And to me, that's the anti-Republican thing, because that's the opposite. Republicans just say it's up to the local, which is a Republican mantra, let the local governments and entities decide. So if that's the case, then locals should be able to decide in their school boards how they want to run things. And that should be the same thing in Virginia. It should be the same thing any state. And so that's something that Democrats need to hone in on too. Like, well, how is that okay for supposed critical race theory, which isn't taught anyways, and again has become a boogeyman. But how's that okay? But then saying that local school boards and local can't enforce mask mandates are the things they feel they need to do in their local elections that Republicans then at the statewide level are trying to overturn. So they've just got to tighten up their messaging, but they've got to get this bill done and passed before the end of the year, because otherwise they're going to come back and it's going to be like they spent this whole year and they didn't get anything major done that they can now go to their constituents next year. And once we get further along in the next year, again, things are not going to pass because now you're so focused on the election coming up that you're not going to get things done. So they've really got to get this done by the end of the year. And they've got a really hardcore campaign about what's in this bill so that their constituents understand it and they can go out and tell them and make sure they have it. So
Yeah, I think that a major takeaway for both Republicans and Democrats should be in the overall irrelevance of former President Donald Trump. And don't run against him if you're a Democrat, and figure out the way where you don't piss off the Trump voters, because you can piss off Trump as long as he keeps it to himself, which is of course not that easy. But if you can keep those voters engaged and heading out for you, it's fine. What you don't want is, if you don't need him to get out there for you, and you don't want to alienate the moderates and the suburban women that we referenced earlier, I think turned on Trump more than anyone else, it seems like, last year. So yeah, I think that obviously, his endorsement will still mean a lot for some fringe candidates, especially in certain pockets of the country. But I think that's where you'll end up with some very interesting primary matchups. And you might have people getting through the primaries that are not particularly strong candidates even within their own state. So it'll be interesting to watch, just like it'll be interesting to continue to watch how things are going in New Jersey. Still locked in at 86%. I just looked and thought maybe we might be up to 87, but we're not. No, it's still right where it was. But it'll be interesting to see where it all goes in the weeks ahead. And make sure that you tune in and find us, and kind of around this time, this Wednesday morning time here on the West Coast, for a couple more weeks. And we know Thanksgiving's coming, so we'll keep everybody posted when they can find the show. But until our next show, Scott, where can people keep in touch with you?
They can find me on Twitter at sman80. That's sman80.
And you can find me right down there at Christian DMZ. And in mere moments here on the Blackcast YouTube channel, you'll find a what they call on YouTube an instant premiere of a brand new episode of our show, Marvel Movie Talk, where our friend Zia is back, and my pal Jeff DeRay. We talk about Venom. We talk about non-spoilers for the Eternals movie, which I am very important, and I got to see early, but I don't spoil anything about it. I just let you know what I think, and just some things coming up. And we even break the format a little bit, and we talk about Dune. So please stay tuned to the Blackcast YouTube channel. That'll be in a few minutes. But follow the show at Biden Time TV on Twitter. I actually remembered to tweet from it ahead of today's show. So thank you. Thanks to everybody who watched live. And we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.